We begin week 3 going over the components of the digestive system. Key point number 1 is looking at what we call the remarkable body according to your textbook. When we look at the body, we somewhat organize the system and talk from the smallest unit to how those units all work together collectively into systems. So first we start with a cell, which is the smallest unit in which independent life can exist. It contains the DNA, which is kind of the defining of the cell's function. That comes somewhat from our heredity, whatever our mother and father passed along to us. Certain groups of cells work together to perform specialized tasks. Those groups of cells we call tissues, such as muscle tissue, blood tissue, bone, etc. And when we have these groups of tissues, they then also can work together to perform specific jobs. We have a group of tissues that work together to form an organ, such as the heart, liver, or brain. Lastly, those organs can then work together to perform a certain function in the body. In particular, we're going to talk about the digestive system in this class, but keep in mind that many of the body systems interrelate when it comes to talking about digestion or nutrition. So a body system is a group of related organs that work together. So for the digestive system, we have the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach. We have the small intestine. All of those work together. In addition, we would consider the liver and the pancreas to be part of the digestive system. To lay some foundational groundwork for what we need to talk about when we talk about absorbing and digesting nutrients, we need to first understand a little bit about body fluids and how they work throughout the body. They supply tissues continuously with energy, oxygen, and nutrients to include water. They also work to remove waste from points of disposal on out, say to the kidneys and then as urine out of the body. So make sure you take some time to read in your text about blood and lymph and some of the difference between those two types of body fluids and how they might communicate and interrelate together. Let's define digestion. Digestion is the breaking down of food particles or molecules into smaller particles. We have voluntary control as a component of our digestion, and then we have certain components that are automatic. So think of when you pick up an apple. You make a voluntary choice whether you're going to bite that apple. And then after you bite it, gee, if there's a brown spot, maybe you choose to spit it out, or you choose to continue to chew it if it tastes good. We choose to chew, and then we choose to swallow. After that point of swallowing, though, it's considered the rest of digestion as automatic. We don't choose when our stomach is going to churn that apple. It's all automatically taken care of. Now, we're going to break digestion into two separate components. We have mechanical forms of digestion, and we have chemical forms of digestion. First, let's address mechanical. Again, if we take the example of our apple, chewing the apple into smaller pieces immediately digests some of that apple. So we take a large particle and we break it down into smaller pieces by masticating with our teeth. Next, as it moves down the esophagus, peristalsis begins to push the food along, and as that muscular action squeezes our GI tract and creates that wave-like movement, it also mechanically breaks down the food to a certain extent. Peristalsis takes place all the way throughout the GI tract, from the esophagus all the way down to the large intestine. We have the stomach, which is a large muscle, very strong muscle, and it churns the food and also breaks it down into smaller particles. We call that mixture, or that paste that ends up in the stomach, chyme. There's 4 major sphincters along the GI tract. We call them the cardiac sphincter, which is at the top of the stomach, the pylorus, or the pyloric sphincter, which is at the base of the stomach, and that controls the outlet of that apple from the stomach into the small intestine. Then we have the ileocecal valve, which is between the small intestine and the large intestine. And then we have the rectum, or the anus, which we're thankful for because it allows us to choose when we want to go to the bathroom versus it being automatic. chemical digestion, the 5 components or areas that we consider as chemical digestion are in the mouth. We have salivary glands, which secrete enzymes. We have the stomach. We have the gastric glands that participate by secreting enzymes and acid. We have the pancreas, which secretes enzymes. We have the liver, which manufactures bile and sends it to the gallbladder, which then secretes that into the small intestine. Lastly, we have the small intestine. Let's talk about each. But before we do, first let's define enzyme. Using medical terminology, it's a quick way to identify if something may be an enzyme. If the word ends in ASE, that's a pretty good tip-off that is some sort of enzyme. For example, lactase breaks down the sugar lactose. The ASE gives us the indication that it's an enzyme. Enzymes are proteins that help speed the rate of a chemical reaction, but that particular protein does not get changed in the process. So it's common to use the example of a justice of the peace. When 2 people come together to get married, that justice of the peace brings them together and keeps them together long enough to make a change happen, and those 2 walk away different. They're now married. But the justice of the peace walks away unchanged, just like an enzyme would from a chemical reaction. Now, in our mouth, we have an enzyme called salivary amylase. And yes, it breaks down a starch called amylose. It starts that breakdown of starch, and we can actually experiment with this. You could take a piece of bread when you're at home sometime this next week, chew it up, and as you keep on chewing it, if you chew it for a long enough time and retain it in the mouth, you'll notice it starts to get more of a sweet flavor to it. That's because you're breaking down those starch units, which are just glucose units all bound together in a long strand. You're breaking them down into smaller units, which have the single units of sugars have a sweet taste to them. Our stomach, then, is where that piece of bread would land next. It goes down the esophagus, ends in the stomach, where there's hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid halts the action of salivary amylase. So starch breakdown stops immediately when that food hits the stomach. We do not consider the stomach a place where digestion of starches take place. But it does begin protein breakdown. Hydrochloric acid works together with a compound called pepsin, which is converted to pepsinogen and acts as an enzyme to break down protein. So both the acid and the enzyme start to break protein down. And we consider the main function of the stomach to be the digestion of protein. Keep in mind the stomach has this beautiful mucus lining, and that's real important to keep the stomach in good health. We have a really high acid content in the stomach, and the only reason that acid doesn't start then acting, and also that pepsinogen enzyme doesn't start acting on the walls of the stomach, because if you think about all of the GI tract is a muscle. Muscles are protein, and that protein would be digested if we didn't have a nice mucus layer to protect it. And that's actually what happens when a peptic ulcer forms, is that mucus layer, it gets too thin or somehow gets compromised so that acids and enzymes are starting to digest the protein lining of the stomach, which is painful. The next area of chemical digestion is related to the pancreas. The pancreas releases enzymes that break down all of the macronutrients. So remember, the macronutrients are carbohydrate, proteins, and fats. And it sends out enzymes that will break all 3 of those down and sends those enzymes into the small intestine. It also secretes something called sodium bicarbonate, with the main function of that being to take that acid that just came out of the stomach and neutralize it, so it's not going to cause burning in our small intestine. The liver helps out because it produces something called bile. And bile is an effective emulsifier that helps us to break those fat particles into smaller droplets and digest them more effectively. So bile is released from the gallbladder into the small intestine when we've eaten some fat in our diet. The small intestine also participates in chemical digestion. In fact, we consider the small intestine to be the major organ of digestion and absorption. The intestinal wall lining secretes enzymes that break down, again, all 3 of the macronutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. vitamins and minerals and water, keep in mind those are not really digested. What we do with those is we absorb them mostly as they're taken in. Fiber, on the other hand, the definition of it is that it does not get broken down. We don't have enzymes to break down the bonds of the carbohydrate in fiber. Therefore, it's not absorbed, and it travels through the GI tract as is.